Ebony Payne and her mom,
Diana.
Diana. They're from Kingman Park, and Kingman Park was recently designated as a. So Ebony will tell us all about it from her perspective. And,
Yeah, thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. So I'm Ebony Payne, and I grew up in Kingman Park. I'm a third-generation native Washingtonian. My family lived over by the waterfront for many years, then Brookland, and then we moved to Kingman Park when I was about 8. My mom has owned her home since 1979. So I wanted to bring her because she can give you actually like the real background history that maybe because at the time when Kingman Park began its historic journey, so to speak, I was actually not living in DC. And so what happened was Kingman Park became historic in 2 parts. And in part 1, my block was not a part of it. We could actually show you the pop-up that a neighbor installed that triggered a backlash. And it's interesting because that particular pop-up I thought was actually very tastefully done because it was a pop back, couldn't really see it from the street. And the person that put it up actually, maybe we want to close the door or, yeah, just it's a little loud. Thank you. So the backlash to the pop-up. So that particular pop-up, as I said, the person lived in the building. So they were they were raising their family, and so it was tastefully done. But, politics, local politics can be very controversial, and so that decision really sparked a local resident who was a lawyer to start the process of getting historic designation. Some years later, you could probably fill in how long the first part took.
So I'm just going by memory here. I didn't do any kind of research or anything, but he filed, the man who filed the application did a lot of research, and, it was a very long, I think it was about 100 pages long application, and he, he had lived in the community for probably at least 40, 50 years, and so he went back and he, took individual houses and he said who lived there, like well, for one thing, it was based on the historic nature of our community, not really the architecture of our community. It was based on the history of our community. And that history was that the houses were originally built for white people. And they tried to sell them to white people, and white people didn't want them because it was close to the Anacostia River, and there was malaria at the time, and there was raw sewage going into the Anacostia River, and there was a dump over there, and so nobody wanted to buy it. No white people wanted that area. So the developer, he changed course and he started marketing it for African American people. And we actually have, I should have brought it, but we actually have one of the very first brochures, that was, marketing it to African American people. And that really was a big success. And so, because it was like one of the very first, communities, I don't know if in the country, but even in Washington, but it was one of the very first communities specifically for African American people, and so a lot of it just sold out, and so that was really, in the final analysis, that was why they decided to go with the historic designation of the community, not because of the architecture, but because of the history.
So at that time, that was part 1. And not every block in Kingman Park was included. So our block,
Well, wait a minute. It actually was included. He asked for all of the community to be included. But,
And then-
but when they made, well, I should go on. So it was very controversial. A lot of people, I would say most of the people, because we did have quite a few people who were in favor of the designation. And, they sent in letters, they testified. And then there were a lot of people who were against it. And, they got a petition together and they went door to door, getting people to sign the petition and send in letters. The community also, one part of the community also had a seminar, that they brought in experts to, talk about, what historic designation would mean to the community, the pros and the cons. And in the final analysis, they came back with a ruling that designated the entire community except for a couple blocks. They took those blocks away. And so they kind of divided the community in that regard.
and was our block.
And it was our particular block. And in the beginning, I was kind of campaigning against historic designation for a while. And then I was like, I don't really know if I'm really against the historic designation or not. But in the beginning, I was definitely working with the side that was against the historic designation. So when the ruling came out, it came out, all of Kingman Park was basically designated as historic except for, our block, which was 20th Street and 19th Street. And then the block D Street, so there was like 3 or 4 blocks that were not designated. And in between that time, do you want to go on with the story in between?
Yeah, well then I moved back to DC, and within about 3 months, it was like the developers had discovered 20th Street. And we had, I remember we had a handyman come, and he had started work on a project, and then like within a week, he was like, man, your block just is exploding with construction. And the city, they converted 2 houses on the alley into, like, they went from, and we live our homes are very small, like single family, 2-bedroom, small closets, homes.
812 square feet.
And they took these 2 row houses and they expanded them to like 10 bedrooms. And neither of the construction, like the developers were different. They didn't try to make it look nice in any way because they weren't the homeowners. So they didn't really care. They're 2 different colors. They're spray painted. It's like, and then there was another house across the street that had a pop-up that was more tastefully done, but it was just right up on the street. You could see it. It just didn't really look nice. And I just really realized that I had not been paying attention. And I knew that the historic redistricting was like going on because I would hear her talk about it. And I was always for it. But I felt like because the characters in the community it was like the roles were starting to reverse, where alliances were starting to be non-traditional, like where people felt like they didn't really like this person personally, but they actually really wanted the historic districting. And then I had a neighbor who was in her 90s, and it really bothered me that she was not considered historic, but I had neighbors who had just moved in like a block away and they were considered historic. So there was a round 2 where the Historic Preservation Office held hearings, and I was given a chance to testify. And I testified exactly that I had this neighbor on my next door neighbor who's in her 90s and has lived here her whole life. And I don't understand why she wouldn't be considered historic if someone else a block away is. And we were successful. And I have to say that once we got historic districting for our block, all of that crazy development totally stopped. So, you know, I've met neighbors who, you know, were against it, and they had corner lots, houses on the corners, on the corner of alleys, and they're more impacted maybe negatively because they have to get more permission to make changes on their homes. But to me, I think it's worth it because it just keeps the integrity of your neighborhood, and you know, it makes it harder for developers who are just in it to flip the houses and they don't care about your community. They just care about making money. They're not raising a family there. They're just there to maximize on their investment. So, so that's my take. And do you have anything that you want to add?
I mean, I kind of, you know, agree with everything that Ebony said, in that, you know, the developers, you know, they just kind of left just ugliness on our block. They permanently changed the character of our block. Not that it's anything special, but it was historic, you know, because they were the original houses there, and the developers came in, and that the two pop-ups on the corner are just really ugly. They're very ugly. They dug down. They dug out a basement, and there was a heritage tree in one of the yards next door. And I remember I would always worry about that tree because whenever there was a hurricane or a large storm, I would always worry about that tree. And then just to watch them digging the roots of the tree in order to, you know, dig out the basement, I even to this day, you know, think about, you know, what the damage was really, you know, it survived, it's still there, it's still standing strong, but that was really disturbing. And, you know, I remember calling the district and complaining, you know, to make, you know, was there anything that they could do? I called the DCRA at the time, DCRA, and they were like, no, they have all of their permits. But then I later found out that DCRA doesn't even issue permits for trees. I found out it's DDOT, the Department of Transportation, that issues the tree. So if you ever have an issue with a tree and a permit, it's the Department of Transportation that issues those permits. So, you know, so we're happy. We both testified, you know, and they ended up designating the entire ANC commission. That was, you know, so it was from the Anacostia River all the way over to the end of the ANC commission, which ends on 19th Street. So the whole community is now historic. And there was another issue in that I really felt like when they made us non-historic and the rest of the community historic, they were really dividing the community, because we're all one community, but they've divided us into historic and non-historic. And at the time, we were also, you know, fighting the fact that we were the only ANC commission on this side of the river that was a part of Ward 7. And that had been the case for 20 years. And we were battling that issue as well, because we didn't really have the same issues as east of the river, and they didn't really know our community. And, you know, everybody else in this direction didn't really care. And so we were like wandering, you know, it was hard to really, it was just hard. We felt like we were divided. You know, we couldn't even park on Capitol Hill. We couldn't park anywhere. So we had, you know, we couldn't even park at our own metro. So for that reason, you know, I was really glad for that, and the developers, I was glad that we were all designated as historic.
So we'll take questions. And then also, we should let you all know that we're running a survey right now about RFK Stadium, which everyone in 5D is welcome to take. But we will be meeting with the mayor. Friends of Kingman Park is meeting with the mayor on October 18th. We do have Carver Langston on our survey. And so I would love to talk to you all about Benning Road and just having like a Benning Road task force, because I find that we're not really communicating Ward 5 and Ward 7, even though we share a very major problematic road. So I'd really like to make, permanent connections so that, we can be advocating together. So, yes.
So my first question is, how long did it take for Part 1 to be designated? From when the attorney filed the application to the actual, decision?
So I don't really know, to be honest with you. It was quite a long process. If I were to guess, it was about from the beginning. It was about 3 years. I'll say between 2. They come to our meeting, HPRB, which is, they came to us, several of our, talked about it, and with several rounds of testimony. All told, it's probably 3 years. Yeah. Part 1 and 2. Yes, Part 1 and 2.
So we've had a speaker from the Department of Planning who works with historical preservation or historical designation? For historical preservation, okay. And she mentioned that to have a successful application, she suggested that we hire an architectural or some type of historian to help document the application, and that the district has more historical designations than most municipalities, so it would be a very competitive process, is what I took out of that. Did you guys, do you know if you had to, or if the attorney hired a historical?
No, I think he did all the research. He, like I said, he lived in the community for decades. And he knew where all of so if you go online, you can actually pull up the application, and you can see, I think you can see the whole application. Okay, and like I said, he did it not architecturally. It wasn't based on the architecture. It was based on the history. And so that's what I would recommend, to look at his application. He did. And there's also there's a historic preservation. It's not a government, historic preservation board, I think it's called. I can find out their contact information, and I would recommend, because they really are advocates for this, designated places as historic. And my experience with the government agents is they really want to designate it. So, you've got an ally in them. That's been my experience with them.
Maybe I can, yeah.
I understand you on that one. And build up these houses and push them out, and have various other people come in with these high rates. What if the living family has been living in this neighborhood for years, and they decided that they wanted to go up for their own family expansion? Mm-hmm. Is that allowed when you do the historic preservation?
Yeah.
Their family plans to live there, continue to live there. They just want a little bit more space. Is Is that allowed?
Yes, it is. I mean, so it probably, you could go and read the rule. They create rules for your community. And they were actually easier on Kingman Park because the people who live in Kingman Park weren't as wealthy as other historic districts. And so they made it less expensive to like replace your windows. They made windows, you know, they gave you more of a latitude. But as far as going up, they had specific rules, like on Capitol Hill, you can do a pop-up, but if you're, I believe this is what it is, if you're standing on the sidewalk and you look up, you can't see, you should not be able to see the pop-up, so it has to be set back. And those are the ones that really blend into the neighborhood. So, but yes, you can do a pop-up. Okay. Not a problem. You have to, you know, adhere to the rules. And the reason why people were against the historic district is because I've never had to pull a permit since the historic district, you know, came in. But, you know, from what I understand, it's definitely more of a process. You have to, you know, adhere to their rules. You know, so it's, from what I understand, it's more expensive. It's more of a process, and it's just harder to do work on your house. And that's why most people didn't want the government telling them what to do. Mm-hmm.
So I have a question, Kevin Horgan. And by the way, actually, I used to live at 1916 C Street, and I remember going to C Street meetings when they were trying to convince the government to do that. So it's great to see the bike lanes.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of questions. One is, since it's become historic preservation, have you actually seen some setback pop-ups built in the neighborhood?
No, I can't think of one.
Okay.
Okay. I can say this. There was, so we live on 20th Street, and we had the three ugly, well, one is okay, but it goes straight up, so it changed the character of the street. And then the other two that were, you know, not done very well. There were other, so if you go up one block, there were larger, but two-story houses attached. It's a very modest community, and I really honestly believe those were like under construction for a long time, and in the end, they didn't go up. And I honestly believe that it would have been, you know, because if you go over to 19th Street, there are big, you know, they go up, you know, they go in front, they go back, and they go up. So they didn't do that on the two on 20th Street in the next 100 blocks. And I believe, I can't prove it, but I think it's because of the historic designation.
My next question is just like right now, my current house, my concrete balusters, the front porch, they're falling apart. There's literally chunks of concrete falling away, exposing the rebar. I need to do it. But concrete work on porches is insanely expensive. So my plan is to replace it with a wood railing done in the style of some of these beautiful old wood porches that I see on Oak Street that are kind of exist. So I'm still going to try to maintain the architectural integrity of, you know, I'm not going to do something crazy modern, but if, let's say Trinidad was, my street was historic preservation, would I be required to keep the same concrete? Would I be allowed to change it into the wood railing, or would that be prohibited?
I can't. So when they came to Kingman Park, like I said, they gave us specific guidelines. Once they designated us, they gave us specific guidelines on what we could do and what we couldn't do. Basically, you can do anything to the inside of your house. It's the outside of your house. So I don't really know. I have a friend who lives in the Barney Circle area, and she is totally against historic designation because she said that she wanted to put a fence around her house, and she would have not been able to have done she has like a picket fence, a wooden picket fence. And she said if they had, I don't know if this is true or not, but this is what she said, they would have required her to put an iron railing, you know, iron work around it, and she couldn't have afforded that. So she's happy that her neighborhood, which is considered Barney Circle or Hill East, they fought the historic designation, and so they're not historic. So I don't really know. you know, the better question would be, you know, I would call the Historic Preservation Review Board, and they could probably answer your questions better.
Yeah, I'm gonna do this in the next few months anyway, so it'll be done. It's, whether or not the neighborhood gets it, I'm asking this question on behalf of neighbors at home who are thinking about projects that they will want to do maybe, 2 years, 5 years from now, and I just want to understand if this happens, what will the expense? Cast iron fences are more expensive than a plastic fence. Going to be required to do, wood windows instead of, if let's say if a neighbor, most houses have probably been through 2 or 3 generations of windows now, because a lot of this neighborhood was, well, some of the neighborhood was built in the 1800s, and as you move up, 1930s, 40s, if a house already has PVC windows, if a neighbor wants to upgrade to new windows, can they stick with PVC or will they be forced to wood? I'm not sure if you know the answer to these questions for your neighborhood, let us know, but this is what I'm thinking about.
Well, we have guidelines. I don't know what they are because I don't know, but there are guidelines, and I could probably find them out and provide them to somebody, and then you would see our guidelines. But I specifically remember they said because we were moderate income community, they weren't holding us to the strict standards that they held, like the Capitol Hill district, where they're really strict, and so they gave us a break.
I have a similar question, and whether, a question that you can answer, whether, Anna, there's someone else. I did miss the last meeting with the presentation, but, my house was built in 1890 something. Over the past 100 or so years, it's been condemned several times. I've looked up the records and it's been condemned, it's been condemned. So it doesn't, and it last was renovated in 1979, after the last time it was condemned. So it doesn't have a lot of the historic features that maybe, like my front porch is very different from the others. Also, like Kevin was saying, mine is falling apart and needs to be replaced. So I'm very interested in how this designation is going to impact individual homeowners rather than pop-ups. I already have a pop-up next to me that's 4 stories and goes back an additional, they built 45 additional feet in the back. It was pre the redoing of the zoning laws. So, in this situation, for example, I have more restrictions on what I can do than the building next to me that is not historic whatsoever, because we do this. So I think I'm not the only one that would have that question. There are a lot of homes that, people have lived in, families have lived in for many generations, and maybe haven't had that kind of renovation that someday, the homeowner would like to do, and what kind of restrictions is that going to have? How do we balance that with trying to save off this condoization and kind of eliminating the single-family home feel in a lot of the neighborhoods? Yes.
I think it really will depend on the type of historical designation. And as they pointed out, they didn't do an architectural designation. Theirs was more on the community and its origins. And that's what I'm advocating for Trinidad, because I don't think we have a particular architectural style. No, we don't have a look. And what we do have is that from 1897, and then as you keep going north, you see, sort of the migration of workers that came into D.C. after World War II, and the construction of row houses from the garden-style apartment. I mean, it's a hodgepodge. I think we don't have a look. We have certain blocks, maybe 6 houses together that have a look, 6 houses together that have a look. But I think with a historic designation as a community, because of either events, people, or whatever, I think there would be, I don't want to say leniency, but as you pointed out, broader. Yeah. unlike Capitol Hill, which has distinct architectural significance, certain architects that built this particular style, Warden, this, that, and the other, we don't have that. Like I know on Capitol Hill, if you want to replace your windows, there is that, you can't replace the original window, but you can put storm windows on top. That's how. And they give you an idea of certain products that don't change the feel.
It'd be good to have kind of a comparison.
What the standards or guidelines or whatever are for, that Capitol Hill strict and then the non-architectural basics.
If you look at what guidelines they provided Kingman Park for construction or what renovation, how broad and.
Yeah, they were very specific, in their instructions. The one thing I remember is that if you were standing on the street, you couldn't, I don't think you can't see, if somebody's gonna pop back, if you were standing on the street, you shouldn't be able to see the pop back. And so that affected people on the corners. Then you could see it from standing on the street. But if you were further in, going back was okay. So, I think the best thing to do is look at Kingman Park, guidelines and Capitol Hill's guidelines, and also ask HPRB, what what they feel they would do with your community.
I would think Trinidad would have a very similar, origin history as Kingman Park. I'm curious what sparked the interest in your community to explore historic designation.
We're trying to get a BZA for a property on Oak Street. And again, that's an example of 6 houses that were built different places. At car yards and then and it's obvious that there was not large anymore.
More?
And a developer had purchased a house and had planned and was applying for a PA to build, including 2 to 5 yards and a garage. And here was other property that's adjacent to that is that person would do and break up the look and feel.
Right. That feels like what happened to our block. And I do understand the concern of, we will probably never get the houses back to what they were. Once they do it, I've asked this question because, as a commissioner, I'm curious, if those houses are just grandfathered in, if the fact that they didn't have a proper permit for the tree. She mentioned that they built or they dug out a basement. There's no other houses on our block with a basement. We live close to the river, so I remember when they dug out the basement, there was really terrible flooding in New Jersey. Actually, it looked very similar to what just happened over the weekend. And there was a family in New Jersey that was living in a basement that I think did not have its proper licenses, permits, and the family died. And so now there is a family down in a basement on a block where no other house has a basement. It was just very shoddily done. And so it's really not clear if it's even safe, if it's up to code. They were just able to do whatever they wanted to do.
DCRA supposedly reviews the flood map, and they use what they call 100-year flood. It never happened in 100 years, so we'll go ahead and grant you the permit. Not to say that it can't happen, but,
Yeah. Yeah.
but my experience, no, they don't, there's no duo, there's no, everyone's kind of grandfathered in from that point in time that the designation happened, so all the bad architecture stays.
Right.
And going forward, the rest of us would be subjected to these new guidelines.
Yeah.
It would stop or at least mitigate, as you pointed out, the developers who are coming in and just like, wow, it's a free for all. Because Trinidad right now, it's the wild, wild west. You know, anything goes.
Right.
Do you find that with having the historic designation that, whatever DCRA is called now, Department of Buildings or whoever, is more attentive or responsive to, how people are built, like following their permits and what they're supposed to do and not working outside the scope of those permits? Because I know, I mean, there have been a lot of cases in this neighborhood where they have not, and we have lost historic buildings because, oops, it fell down. And not necessarily, I mean, I think one of the issues with CCRA overall was that they, you know, were understaffed and not responding. But I'm wondering if with the historic designation that there's any kind of difference in the attention.
Yeah.
There is a check mark, about for historic preservation. And whatever guidelines apply to your permit for that property has to be reviewed.
But are they doing more inspections or more responsive to complaints about not being, like in theory they should be, but in practice, have you seen that? You don't know?
I don't really have any experience in this area. I do know this, that, we really wanted to, you know, it was the, you know, we were designated historic. We would have liked to have gotten flags that says historic designation on it. There was no money for that, you know, and they do say that there is money, allocated if you qualify. There's some kind of money for qualify, to help pay for the extra expense. Now, whether anybody, I don't, you know, I think it's kind of the same thing with the flags. It's not really funded very much, and so it sounds good in theory, but it doesn't really stand out for most people.
And I would say from the ANC's perspective, you still really have to be on top of all the BZA applications that come in, because they just try and slip in changes. So I would say not to rely on the Department of Buildings. That's it.
By the way, if anyone just Googles Kingman Park Design Guidelines, the very first link on Google is going to give you the PDF on the Office of Planning website.
I haven't even seen it.
Sitting here right now, just looking through it. I mean, it's probably pretty summary, but if folks want to find it, I put the link into the chat log, but I'm not sure how that pops up on YouTube if it does. And let you know.
And you might be able to find the original application as well.
I have found that, and it is shocking how long and detailed it is. And I'm like, when I looked at it, I was like, if that's what it takes to get historic preservation, it is a heavy lift.
It was a heavy lift.
Yeah.
And it,
I remember when I was going through that, and there was a lot of stuff. I got it in part about.
yeah.
I moved to Kingman Park in 2009, and when I first went there, I'm going to get involved in the neighborhood meetings. And I remember going to some of the Kingman Park Civic Association meetings. Basically got hounded out of there. It was not welcome. And I just remember, like, and I, you know, you're being polite, but I'm going to say, when I was there, and this, I think the process had started around then, basically it was railroaded through. The reasons I don't think were, you know, I mean, I actually think they probably did the right thing, but because they hadn't gotten input from the community, so much of the community fought back because of how he went about it.
Yes.
It was probably the right thing to do, how he went about it, not getting feedback. The ANC wasn't involved, the ANC voted against it. And it was kind of surprising the city still did it despite the ANC opposing it. But eventually, I mean, the application stood on its merits, and the neighborhood did merit it. And I'm glad it worked out that way. But yeah, that.
So then you would actually have some inside information to the internal local, hyper local politics of it all. I mean, we can really show you like the house that sparked it, and it can be that personal. And I would try and not make it a wedge issue. Don't let it become a wedge issue in the community, because I think you're right. Where the way that he went about it was very divisive, where it didn't really need to be that way. And yeah, so that was the one issue that I felt on that person's side. And then almost on every other issue, we would have totally, completely different feelings. So. Well, I think 2020 was when our block, I remember it was during the pandemic. So about 2020 was for part two, and 3 years before then, 2017.
Yeah, before, I remember we did, as a community, we went down to the Historic Preservation Office. That was one of the things. They came to our meeting, so that would have been before 2020 for sure. And like I said, they did come several different times to our meeting. I think the whole thing started maybe in 2017. 2017. I'm not really sure.
But we're happy because, now with RFK, that's like a major development project, and at least we have historic designation. It's not going to stem whatever will happen, but at least the city has to respect our neighborhood a little bit more. We're invited to all the meetings. It does give us something, it gives us leverage that we otherwise wouldn't have. Like Hill East isn't historic, and in fact, they're not even districted into their nearest plot of land, empty land, vacant land, Reservation 13, and that has had huge negative consequences for them. Like city services, they don't have to respond to the residents that live across the street. The city doesn't owe them anything legally because they're not districted into their nearest empty development lot.
Which is basically the waterfront.
Yeah. It's all the land. Are you familiar with Reservation 13, where it is? Yeah, it's right by the jail. It's like the jail and then St. Coletta's. Yeah, so all of that land. Yes. Yeah. And so, that has had real consequences for them. Like they'll try and get different government agencies to show up to their meetings, and the government agencies don't have to, so they don't. They don't owe them any answers to any questions. So yeah, it really matters. And then do you have a civic association? Okay. Right. Yeah. Right. right, very dramatic,
Very dramatic.
yeah,
Drug plays, to be branding.
right, no ma, right. Oh, I wanted to follow up, so I would highly recommend getting a civic association started. And one of the things that ended up really helping Kingman Park during redistricting is that our bylaws for Friends of Kingman Park encompassed not just Kingman Park, but also Rosedale. And so because of that, and so Kingman Park historically is divided from Rosedale along 19th Street, and then Rosedale goes to 15th Street. And then the Capitol Hill Historic District starts at 15th Street. So when redistricting came, we were able to say that technically this other community was like a part of us, because our bylaws encompassed the whole region, even though they technically were a different neighborhood and distinct and had their own civic associations. We were still able to successfully like absorb them into Ward 7 from Ward 6. And it was because, in part because our bylaws encompassed them. It was our civic association, Friends of Kingman Park.
Is that to define the boundaries
For the civic association. Yes. Even though Rosedale is not considered historic. It's just, the historic district for Kingman Park starts at 19th Street and then goes east. Yes, yes.
That's going to be interesting anyway, because Main Street,
Okay, okay,
there was a point at 8th Street.
okay.
Was part of Ward 5, but now, and it's just gonna depend on who's on city council,
Right?
that's the politics of it. Because it wouldn't surprise me if Ward 6 now will move further north and take Union Market and Trinidad.
And so, and that's why,
boundaries that
does it include Gallaudet?
no.
No.
West Virginia
Okay,
to Batesburg, and also the Gallaudet,
Okay.
Florida, Mount Olivet, that's where, but Gallaudet, I think, always had it as a
Oh, yeah, which has its own, because they were the first African-American school for the deaf and, well, at that time they called them deaf and dumb, but,
uh-huh, right,
and that's, yeah, it's a lot of history.
right. So in your, when you form your civic
Yeah,
association,
that's not saying that's probably not gonna happen. Only because most of the people on the board of our last state representation, the reason it's tentative is because there was furthering the organization
mm-hmm,
and neighborhood association for a decade.
yeah,
And there's been a lot of interest in having it. I've had many up, and it's, that it's not just
fun and games.
yeah, like there's paperwork, and you have to get, you have to become an organization, you have to do taxes, you have to do
Yeah,
all this stuff, you have to do books. And you have to, at that point, I never heard of them again.
right,
So I think that that's a whole other project, that if that was what was needed, that there wouldn't be anyone to look at that work on application for a correct designation. Practically, I don't know anyone who,
you don't have a lawyer in your community that
there's a
can,
lot of lawyers here.
okay,
They're not gonna, no, it's not creating it. We had it, it was kind of like, we can get this to you, we have the bank account, it was that day to day, not have it.
Okay, right. I understood, just,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
understand.
I think that's just the reality, that I don't.
I think the only way you can get people to coalesce around something like that is if there's an issue that's gonna galvanize.
Exactly.
You know, like the Moore Street thing was an issue where we had a big turnout. So it has to be, you know, an issue to generate that interest, you know. Oh, we're gonna convert the park there to a dog park. Oh, I think that would generate a lot of.
I think there are a lot of people who are interested in participating, and who are.
The doing.
I think if we approach it as just sort of like the issue and why we're organizing, and just kind of do it like, you know, back in management term, tiger teams.
Well, I have to say, there's a time, so I thought we might have this until 8, but it turns out that we're gonna start, next time we're gonna start at 6, so we will run until 8.
Can I just give you, so rskfuture.org. And I have paper surveys, I guess I can make them, if you would like.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay.
And I emailed for my newsletter, so that you can send to everybody.
Perfect.
Also, we're going to have a walkabout given by the historically, we're going to have a trend-in walkabout.
Okay, right now?
No, not now, we have to set up a time.
Oh, sure,
Yeah,
sure.
but, yeah,
Okay.
really nice. So we can get more time.
Yeah, definitely. That would be great.
And that reminds me, just one more thing, HPRB was required to send out notices to everybody, you know, whoever the designation is, they will send out a notice to that house, you know, giving them notice that it's happening, or that at least their houses, you know, have been designated, in an application. So that will get people's attention.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone want a paper survey? Yes? Okay.
I want a big park there, not a stadium.
Good, we have that as an option. I'll give you your,
Yes, you
Okay. Thank you guys so much for coming in. You're welcome to join us outside too if you want, anybody wants to continue, if you want to. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for coming on Zoom and, on, YouTube. We'll see you soon. Next meeting will be at, 6. So we'll make sure we have an hour and a half before we have to leave. Okay, take care, everybody.